There's a number you don't say out loud. Not to your partner, not to your closest friend, sometimes not even to yourself. Not directly, not with the lights on. It lives somewhere between your checking account balance and the back of your throat. A number that represents, depending on who you are, either how much you owe, how little you have, or how far you are from wherever you decided safety was supposed to feel like. Most people carry this number the way they carry an old injury, quietly, carefully, adjusting their posture around it without quite acknowledging why. We talk about money constantly. It's in every conversation about careers, relationships, cities, futures. And yet the actual texture of what money feels like, the specific quality of dread that arrives at 2 a.m. when a bill clears wrong, the low hum of shame that follows a financial mistake you made 3 years ago. That part almost never gets spoken. It lives in a register that's just below language, which is strange when you think about it, because financial fear is one of the most universal human experiences on Earth. It crosses culture, class, and generation. It visits the person with nothing, and in its own particular form, the person with everything. And yet each person who carries it tends to experience it in almost complete private isolation, as if theirs is a personal failure rather than a near universal condition. This essay isn't about how to fix your finances. It's about something prior to that, something that rarely gets examined directly. It's about what financial fear actually is, where it lives in you, and why it behaves the way it does. Start with a basic observation about the human nervous system.
The brain does not distinguish cleanly between physical threat and social threat. This is not a metaphor, it is neuroscience. When you receive a call from a debt collector, or open a bank statement you've been avoiding, or sit across from someone who asks how much you make, the same threat detection circuitry activates as it would if something physically dangerous had entered the room. Cortisol rises. The amygdala flags the moment as requiring immediate response. The body prepares. For most of human evolutionary history, this made perfect sense. Scarcity was physical. Running out of food meant dying. Being excluded from the group, which in early social structures often followed from being perceived as a liability, also meant dying. The anxiety that attaches itself to financial precarity isn't irrational. It is ancient, and it is calibrated to a world that no longer quite exists, but whose logic the nervous system has not been updated to reflect. This creates a specific cognitive problem. The threat is real. The emotional response is real. But the response is calibrated for a different kind of danger, one that required immediate physical action. And the threat of debt, or financial instability, or monetary inadequacy doesn't respond to immediate physical action. It is slow-moving, structural, abstract. Your body tells you to run. There is nowhere to run. And so the arousal finds nowhere to discharge and becomes chronic. That chronic, undischargeable state is what most people are describing when they say they're stressed about money. It's not stress in the colloquial sense. It's a nervous system in sustained threat activation, looking for an exit that the nature of the threat doesn't provide. There's a psychologist named Shlomo Benertzi who has spent decades studying the gap between what people know they should do financially and what they actually do. His findings, and the findings of the broader behavioral economics field he helped develop, point to a consistent pattern. Financial decisions are almost never purely rational, even when the person making them is highly intelligent and fully informed. This seems obvious, one stated, but its implications are underappreciated. We have built an entire cultural infrastructure around the assumption that financial failure is primarily an information problem. If people just understood compound interest, if they just knew how to budget, if they just read the right books, followed the right advice, had the discipline to execute the right plan. The self-help industrial complex, the financial literacy movement, the endless content economy around money management, all of it rests on this premise. But Benertzi and others have shown repeatedly that information is not the binding constraint. People who can articulate exactly why they should be saving more, who understand the mathematics of retirement compounding, who have read every book, still don't do it. Not because they're weak, but because the decision isn't actually being made by the part of the brain that reads books. It's being made by older, faster, more emotionally saturated systems. Systems that experience $1 today as fundamentally more real than $1 in 30 years. Not because they've done the math wrong, but because the emotional weight of present and future is simply not equal and never has been. Financial fear, in this light, isn't a failure of knowledge. It's a collision between two different cognitive architectures operating simultaneously in the same mind.
In 1899, the sociologist Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption, the practice of spending money not for utility, but for status signaling. His observation was that in modern societies, what you own and what you spend functions as a communication system. It broadcasts information about your position in the social hierarchy. And because human beings are deeply, constitutively social animals, hardwired to track their status relative to others, because status historically determined access to resources in mates, this broadcasting system produces powerful psychological effects. What's less often discussed is the inverse, conspicuous scarcity, the experience of not having what your social environment signals you should have, the specific shame of being visibly or even just privately below where the people around you seem to be. This shame has a particular texture. It isn't just sadness or worry. It carries with it a social verdict, a sense of having been weighed by an invisible audience and found lacking. And because financial position in modern societies is so thoroughly entangled with notions of intelligence, discipline, and moral character, the story, "I am financially struggling," almost always arrives bundled with, "and this reveals something about who I am." That bundling is culturally produced, not logically necessary. A person who is drowning in medical debt did not make a moral error. A person who graduated into a financial crisis and never fully recovered isn't displaying a character flaw. But the emotional experience of financial precarity doesn't wait for that analysis. It comes preloaded with judgment, borrowed from a culture that has, for centuries, treated poverty as evidence of personal failure and wealth as evidence of personal virtue. There is a specific phenomenon that researchers call financial avoidance, and it is one of the more interesting psychological features of how people relate to money. It works like this. A financial situation becomes stressful. The stress makes thinking about the situation aversive. The person begins to avoid thinking about it, not checking the account, not opening the statements, not making the calls. The avoidance reduces short-term anxiety, which reinforces the avoidance behavior. Meanwhile, the financial situation unattended often worsens, which makes it more stressful when finally confronted, which increases the avoidance. This is a textbook avoidance loop. The same mechanism that operates in anxiety disorders, in difficult relationship conversations, in medical symptoms people don't want diagnosed. The mind learns that not looking temporarily reduces the unpleasant feeling, and so it stops looking. The problem, decoupled from attention, continues to evolve in the dark. What's striking about financial avoidance is how rational it feels from the inside. People who engage in it don't experience themselves as hiding. They experience themselves as managing, as not dwelling, as being practical about what they can and can't control right now. The avoidance is almost always accompanied by a narrative that frames it as a coping strategy rather than a compounding problem. And here's where it gets complicated. Sometimes it is a coping strategy. Sometimes the information that would come from looking is genuinely not actionable in the present moment, and the anxiety it would produce would not motivate productive behavior, but would simply reduce the person's capacity to function. The psychology of financial avoidance isn't uniformly self-destructive. It's context-dependent, nuanced, and deeply human.
Let's talk about the relationship between financial fear and identity, because this is where things get psychologically dense. For most people in the developed world, what you do for money and how much of it you have has become one of the primary scaffolding systems of the self. Not in a surface way, not just what do you do for work as a conversation opener, but in a deep, structural way. Your financial situation tells you a story about your value, your capability, your future, your past decisions, your place in the world. It is for many people one of the central narratives through which they understand who they are. This creates an unusual vulnerability because narratives of the self are not like other beliefs. They are not easily updated by evidence. They are defended unconsciously with considerable psychological force because to revise the story of who you are is experienced as a kind of death, even when the revision would be accurate and useful. A person who has built their identity around financial success, not just security, but success, will experience a financial setback not merely as a practical problem, but as a threat to the coherent self. The response, predictably, won't be purely practical. It will be colored by shame, by denial, by the distortion that comes when the ego is involved in what should be an analytical process. Conversely, a person who has built their identity around financial struggle, who has absorbed the story of scarcity so completely that it has become a defining feature of their self-concept, will, research consistently shows, make financial decisions that inadvertently reproduce that scarcity. Not from stupidity, but because identity has gravity. We tend, without awareness, to return to the shape we believe ourselves to be. There is a body of research emerging from the intersection of developmental psychology and behavioral economics that locates the roots of adult financial psychology in surprisingly early experiences. The specific memory is rarely of money itself, it's of the emotional atmosphere that surrounded money in the household you grew up in, whether it was spoken about or silenced, whether scarcity was a source of shame or simply a practical condition, whether spending was associated with pleasure and generosity or with guilt and irresponsibility, whether the adults around you treated financial uncertainty with equanimity or with panic. These early emotional templates, what some researchers call money scripts, operate largely below conscious awareness in adulthood. They are not beliefs you hold, they are lenses through which financial reality is automatically filtered before you have time to think about it. Someone whose early experience associated money with conflict will find in adulthood that financial conversations with partners activate a disproportionate emotional charge. Someone who absorbed the script that money is always about to run out will experience financial anxiety even in periods of genuine security, because the script predates the security and doesn't update cleanly with new evidence.
This is not determinism. The scripts can be identified, examined, and gradually revised, but they cannot be revised by information alone. They require a different kind of engagement, slower, more personal, and more willing to sit with discomfort than most financial advice ever asks you to be. Here's what I find most interesting when I look at all of this together. Financial fear is treated in most cultural contexts as a temporary condition, something to be moved through, solved, resolved, a problem with an answer on the other side. And so we produce an endless stream of answers: budgeting systems, investment strategies, debt payoff frameworks, financial independence movements, all built on the premise that the right information applied with sufficient discipline will dissolve the fear. But fear, as any psychologist will tell you, doesn't dissolve on the basis of information. It transforms, or it doesn't. But the transformation is not primarily cognitive. What I observe, looking at the research and looking at how people actually live inside their financial lives, is that the fear often persists well past the point where the external circumstances would seem to justify it. The person who was once genuinely precarious and who has since achieved genuine stability still carries the internal weather of precarity, still wakes at 3 a.m. with a nameless financial dread that doesn't correspond to the numbers in their account, still makes decisions colored by a scarcity that is now historical rather than current. And conversely, the person in genuine, acute financial distress sometimes carries themselves with a lightness that surprises observers, because they have made, somewhere along the way, a private peace with uncertainty. Not acceptance in the passive sense, but a settled relationship with the fact that the future cannot be controlled, that the worst can be survived, that the self is not equivalent to the net worth. This gap between external financial reality and internal financial experience is, I think, the most under-examined dimension of how money actually operates in a human life. There's a concept in Buddhist psychology, and I raise it not as a spiritual recommendation, but as a precise psychological description, called dukkha. It's often translated as suffering, but the more accurate translation is something like unsatisfactoriness, a fundamental quality of experience in which things are always slightly off, slightly insufficient, slightly not quite right. The economist would describe this as the hedonic treadmill, the consistent finding that increases in wealth past a certain threshold produce only temporary increases in well-being before the baseline reasserts itself. You get the raise,
You feel better for a while. The feeling fades. The new baseline is the new normal. The anxiety resumes, now calibrated to a higher number.
The silence isn't random. It's maintained by a specific social contract that treats financial vulnerability as private failure rather than shared condition. And that contract, like most social contracts, is so thoroughly internalized that it rarely requires enforcement. People enforce it on themselves. What would change if that contract loosened? Not collapsed. There's something appropriate about financial privacy, but loosened slightly, enough to allow for the kind of honest conversation that would reveal financial fear not as a personal pathology, but as an almost universal feature of modern life. I don't think it would solve anything precisely, but it might do something that solving can't do. It might make the fear less lonely. And loneliness, it turns out, is one of the primary mechanisms through which fear amplifies. The thing that is witnessed, named, and recognized in others becomes subtly more bearable, not smaller, but more possible to carry. The fear probably won't go away. Not entirely, not for most people. But there's a difference between a fear you're running from and a fear you've turned to face. The running takes more out of you. It occupies more of your peripheral vision. It shapes more of your decisions in ways you can't quite account for. The facing doesn't make the fear smaller, but it makes you larger than it, or at least less organized around it. That's not a solution. It's not a resolution. It's just a different way to live inside the same uncertainty that everyone, without exception, is already living inside. And sometimes that's the only honest thing left to say. Thank you for staying with Void Wander until the end of this episode. In a world where everything is competing for your attention, the fact that you chose to sit down and actually listen, to me, that means more than you might think. If this episode left something in your mind, even just a small question, a different angle, then it's done its job. See you in the next episode of Void Wander.